But I'd like to kick off this meeting and move into our first session. So this first session is going to be our research session. So we heard some perspectives yesterday, and we heard about some of the work that folks are currently doing here in Eastern Oregon. But that wouldn't be possible without considering the best available science. And in this session, we're going to hear from some researchers that work hard to study fire and other natural disturbance processes and examine the effects on the ecosystems and inform some of the restoration planning and treatments. So I want to introduce our first speaker, which is going to be Dr. Cameron Nafsi. Cameron is an ecologist whose research focuses on landscape dynamics of natural and human disturbances, forest mortality processes, and ecological thresholds in temperate forests. He is currently a research scientist in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society in the College of Forestry at Oregon State University. Cameron's going to talk about some fire regimes of moist mixed conifer forest here in the northern Blue Mountains this morning. So welcome, Cameron. And just remind everyone to stay muted, and the Q&A session will begin at 9:45. And please type your questions into the chat box. Sorry.
Thanks, Jacob. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Let me know, are you seeing the screen pretty well there?
Yep, it looks good.
Good. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for organizing this. I'm glad to be with you all. I'm going to be talking about some research that we've been working on for the last several years now. We're coming to the end of kind of the first phase of this planned work that takes place in the northern Blue Mountains. This is work that Laura Platt, a graduate student at Portland State University with Andres Holtz, has primarily led, along with the team that you see here on the slides. So I'm going to be relaying a lot of the information that she's found and the discoveries that she's made over the last couple years. I'll start with just a brief framework. I think this is a model that is familiar to a lot of you, of these two sort of ends of the spectrum of gradients of forest types and biophysical conditions. High elevation forests, also called sometimes climate limited systems. These are wetter, colder forests that tend to have higher severity fire regimes. Infrequent fire that happens on the order of every 100 to sometimes several hundred years. And as we go down in elevation, we arrive at the lower elevation ponderosa pine, dry mixed conifer forest. These are forest types that are characterized as fuel limited systems, much more frequent fire, tend to be of lower severity. And in the middle, we have quite a range of behaviors and forest types and conditions that I want to talk about in the framework specifically of what the ecological dynamics and resilience mechanisms are across this gradient. And so if we step back and look at these climate limited systems, what we think essentially about how they're resilient to fire and why they're able to recover from fires, it has a lot to do with these long recovery periods, the infrequency of fire that occurs, and the high regeneration success that they have in between those times as a result of cooler, moister conditions, less arid, less drought, and less frequent drought conditions and so on. And then also a number of species functional traits that allow them to recolonize even sometimes large, high severity patches, given the long recovery periods that they have. These are things like lighter seeds that carry further, serodony, think about lodgepole pine or black spruce or some of those types of species. And if we think about the dynamics and the resilience mechanisms in these fuel limited systems, what we know about these systems is that they tend to have low abundance of fuels, very patchy fuels overall. They are populated heavily with fire-resistant species and fire-resistant structures. So larger trees, diverse structural conditions as well, and really a fine scale patterning across the landscape that influences fire behavior and creates heterogeneity in fire behavior as well. And when we think about the models that we have for these intermediate forests, forests at intermediate moisture conditions, elevational gradients, or mixed severity fire regimes, we have a lot more questions. And there's a lot of theories and ideas about what regulates, what the ecological dynamics are and what regulates resilience in these ecosystems. So I've listed a few of these here, but I put the question marks here because we still have a lot of questions about when each of these are important, under what conditions and what ecosystems and geographies. So you may have heard yesterday, for instance, from Paul Hesberg about the importance of the patch mosaic in regulating fire behavior and the nature of the patch mosaic itself, these feedbacks that exist between the heterogeneity of the serial conditions, the successional conditions, and the structural types, and what results in any given fire event. They oftentimes have greater climate variability, so these are not as fuel limited and they're not as climate limited as forests on either of the extremes. Oftentimes these ecosystems are located in places with diverse topographic conditions, which can translate to diverse fire outcomes. And then also just the species diversity that a lot of these forests have. They oftentimes have overlapping ranges of different species, and relative to upper and lower elevation forests, a little bit more diversity. And if we think about what we know about fire exclusion effects in dry forests, now focusing on those, this is some data from Andrew Merschel that shows across a pretty broad swath of the Pacific Northwest, this very classic story of relatively frequent fire across most sites that, that essentially experienced a very abrupt decline in the late 1800s to early 1900s. And following that, of course, was a process of increased homogenization, increased densification of these forests. But what about these forests in between that we're sort of focusing on for this talk, and that this work has been centered around? These moist mixed conifer forests that occupy this middle range of the biophysical conditions, and oftentimes we think have mixed severity fire regimes. Well, some of the models that we have, for instance, here's one from land fire. What you can see in this map are lower severity regimes in the orange, yellowish color here. Higher severity regimes are in the bluish color here. And then this gray color are fire regime group 3. And you can see in the table how each of these different fire regime groups are characterized according to land fire. And one of the things you notice about this model is this huge range in fire frequencies, 35 to 200 years. So that's a very big range if you're a manager and you're trying to understand what fire frequency was like in this ecosystem, how it might influence management, silvicultural prescriptions, restoration needs. You can see yourself having very different interpretations with that broad range. And then again, the classification is low and mixed severity. There's a lot of questions about what mixed severity means for any given ecosystem, for any given location. So it's not always a clear guideline that we can just work off of. And so I think as a result, where we're at right now and what motivated this work in large part was a set of questions that revolved around these moist mixed conifer forests and these intermediate ranges, and what were they really like? What were the historical fire regimes? What have been the effects of past management on these ecosystems? What were their ecological dynamics? How resilient will they be to change? And what are the restoration needs and appropriate strategies? So this is really the motivating sort of context and set of ideas that we came to this research with. And one last brief introductory note about what we think and what we know about moist mixed conifer forests in central to eastern Oregon. One is that this is in some ways a unique setting. There's a lot of gentle topography, or this bisected canyon plateau topography in different portions of central and eastern Oregon, which contrasts with, for instance, areas that I've worked a lot in the Northern Rockies, which is much more rugged terrain overall. And partly as a result of this, we have a lot more intermixing of dry and moist mixed conifer forest types within this ecosystem. And there's been some work that's been done in these ecosystems, really trying to dig into this concept and this idea of how forests vary across gradients, both of species composition and also in terms of fire dynamics. This is a graphic from Johnson et al. And what he shows you here is as you move from these drier pine and dry mixed conifer forests into forests that have a higher proportion of fire sensitive species like grand fir, there is some increase in or decrease in fire frequencies or an increase in the mean fire intervals, but it's relatively moderate. And so the argument that they've made is that there's fairly similar fire dynamics, or at least fire frequency, occurring across this gradient of dry to moist mixed conifer forest. And a lot of this work has come out of the out of Central Oregon, out of the Ochocos and the Southern Blue Mountains. And we have been working for this series of studies in the Northern Blue Mountains, which is in a couple different watersheds that I'm going to be talking about today, in particular Jubilee Lake and Beaver Creek here. And you can see, if you look at the color in the back here, we've classified forest types within the area as this dry mixed conifer ponderosa pine in yellow. Green is the moist mixed conifer types, and then blue are these upper elevation climate limited systems within the region. And so what we were really trying to do with this work is place our emphasis squarely within this moist mixed conifer forest types that we think we have less understanding of. Some brief notes. I won't get too much into technical details today. I really want to talk about the substance of what we've been finding, but I did want to introduce some unique aspects of the sample design that we've been using. And it's kind of this multi-proxy, multi-scale research design where we've been integrating historical aerial imagery and vegetation reconstructions based on that, along with dendroecological sampling in this sort of hierarchical model where we've been sampling sub-watersheds, and within sub-watersheds, sampling within a subset of patches. And within each of these patches, sampling two types of data, which I'll mention briefly, but fire scars to reconstruct fire history, and age structure data, so we can understand something about the ecological dynamics and actually the severity of these fires historically. And so this is the kind of multi-scale stratification and sample design that we've been using to make sure we're able to collect a sample that really stretches across the gradients of interest rather than focusing too much on small areas. And briefly again about methods, with respect to this initial model I laid out of climate limited versus fuel limited systems, we've had different sampling methodologies for these systems. Oftentimes age structure data is used in climate limited systems where fire scars are not abundant, and ages can correlate well. It's an approximation of fire dates, but they can correlate fairly well. Whereas in these drier fuel limited systems with more frequent fire, we've traditionally employed fire scar analyses. And in this work, we actually did a combination of both. So we've been using networks of fire scars overlaid with plots where we sample age structure data. This is a close-up of Jubilee Lake. You can see here in this inset map here, the patches are color-coded according to these different structural stages that are defined by a variety of, these are sort of multivariate categories of forest structure. The main thing I'd like you to notice here, and to the side, you can see the percentages of the watershed that's in each of these. And the main take-home point is that for Jubilee Lake, a lot of them were, of the sub-watershed area was in the stem exclusion, so sort of young, more simple aged categories, stand initiation, which are very young post-fire, at least post-disturbance regenerating sites, and then some that are in this understory reinitiation phase, which is a slightly more advanced successional stage. For Beaver Creek, located down here south of La Grande, you see a slightly different pattern. In this case, this SECC and SEOC are again the stem exclusion phases, and we see some of that within the watershed. We see quite a lot of the stand initiation, this young regenerating stand type. And then we also see a component of understory reinitiation, so this intermediate complexity stand type. And one of the things to point out is that in neither of these watersheds did we see what we interpreted from the aerial photographs as a lot or abundant old forest types, right? So younger forest overall. Here's some of our data of fire histories and age structure. So here's Jubilee Lake, here's Beaver Creek. Each of these graphs shows one of our patches that we sampled and the fire histories that we reconstructed for each patch are represented here. These vertical lines are fires, and these triangles are where the age structure indicated a cohort, so a regeneration response essentially to these fires, or it could have been to other factors as well. The color coding is green for moist mixed conifer, and then one of our sites was actually characterized as dry mixed conifer ponderosa pine. So some brief points about the data and what we found. Jubilee Lake had a bit of a shorter record. You can see both in terms of the overall length of the record and also the predominance of when most of the fires in our record were occurring. It had a much shorter record, a more recent record, and not as long of a fire history record as Beaver Creek did. This we think is due to a couple different reasons, and I'll show you some of the data on age composition, but Jubilee Lake was heavily dominated by Grand Fork, which is not a phenomenal recorder of fires, to say the least. And in Beaver Creek here, you can see these slightly longer fire histories. And I want to take a moment now to highlight one thing of importance that we've been thinking about and working on with this study in particular. Oftentimes when we do these fire history studies, we calculate things like the median fire intervals based on the interval between scars. So between any two of these fire scars, that would be our interval data. What we've seen in these systems is not only that they had these intervals, but between scars, but there are these open intervals, sometimes lasting over 100 years or so. You can see in this site here, for instance, its last fire was in 1750 and it hadn't burned since then. And if we use these techniques of scar-to-scar interval calculations, we end up leaving these long periods without fire, these fire-free intervals, out of the data set. And this can potentially skew some of our interpretations. And so we've been employing a couple different techniques, survival analysis here to deal with that. This allows us to include those open intervals. And I just wanted to briefly highlight the impact that that has on our statistics. So if we look here at Jubilee Lake and Beaver Creek, the median fire return intervals were 30 and almost 40 years for these two watersheds. And I show the ranges of those median fire intervals from all the different plots down below. The 2 points I want to make here is the importance of including these open intervals, these long fire-free intervals in our statistics. They're a part of the ecology and we need to use methods that allow us to incorporate those. And variation. The median is one estimate of what fire was doing in an area, but the variability around that median is actually really important. And you can see the broad range, even in the median intervals when we look at that, and it's a really important part of these ecosystems. If we look at the full range of fire regimes, you can see that this variability is really quite significant in some cases. And if we use these survival analyses that allow us to include these long fire-free periods as well, you can see how this influences both the median and in some cases the estimates of variation as well. So these move from 30 to 42 years and 40 to 47 years. And it may be more important in some systems than others. You can see that difference between Jubilee Lake and Beaver Creek, for instance. If we look here at some of the fire severity mediated dynamics of these moist mixed conifer forests, what I'm showing you here is just sort of a frequency of this metric that we use to estimate fire severity from dendroecological records. The color coding here is probably the most informative part of this. Yellow are lower severity fires. Orange are moderate severity fires that would have killed an intermediate amount of the overstory canopy cover. And then red are high severity fires. And the box plot up top just shows the distribution of the severity metric across all sites pooled. And what you can see is that essentially this was a very mixed severity regime overall. It was dominated, I would say, by these moderate to high severity fires, but there was quite a mix of across all the different severity categories. And if we look at this general stand age characteristics of these forests, we see that the median age was about 70 years or a little bit less. There's certainly some variability. There were some older forests in these watersheds on the order of 150 years or more. But the median value is right here around 70 years. So this is what I would call relatively young or at least intermediate age forest, rather than forest dominated by sort of old growth conditions, which is one of the findings for some of these climate limited systems in other areas. And this last graphic is something that's called the stand replacing equivalent in terms of the number of events. And what it means essentially is how many events, fire events, did it take to cumulatively result in high severity effects, or sort of complete turnover of the trees on site. And what we see is that the median value here is centered right at 2. And so this means that essentially trees within both of these sub-watersheds on average were surviving one fire and then were sort of recycled by the second fire. So this is a very sort of transient dynamic is the way that I would describe it, with high turnover rates. These are data just showing the establishment and fire history data together. Jubilee Lake is on the left here. Beaver Creek is on the right. What we're showing here in these box plots are just the distribution of tree ages within each of the different species. The species are color-coded down here. These asterisks show these pulses of recruitment that were identified by a statistical technique called char analysis. And each of these fires here recorded through fire scars and other evidence are represented as triangles, and the severity is either low, moderate, or high, according to this color scheme here. The main point I want you to take from here is, again, driving home this point of how young the forest was. In a lot of these cases, you can see that it was much more skewed towards young forest in Jubilee Lake, and heavily dominated by grand fir, with a bit of larch as well. Beaver Creek also had a lot of grand fir and some spruce, but also had a really important component of larch in many stands, these pink colors here, and lodgepole pine in yellow here. So a little bit more diverse and more heavily populated by fire resistant or fire adapted species. Thinking about, and you can see both, I think as a result of that, older and more complex stand structures. Some of these stands having survived multiple fires, right? Whereas that was not as much the case in a lot of these stands at Jubilee Lake. I think looking at these patterns overall, what I want you to take is the diversity of fire severity at each of these sites. You can see that most sites are not dominated by an individual sort of type of fire severity. There's a lot of mix going on over time and actually over space as well. And that's what I want to show you in this next graphic. These graphics here show us the percent of sample sites recording fire for any given year. So these large spikes are areas that were recorded in a higher percentage of our samples. And these 4 spikes are highlighted here: 1894, 1852, 1802, and 1783. And these are graphics showing our sample patches and where fire was recorded and what the severity of it was. So these black dots are fire scar samples that recorded fire for any given year, or for the year shown in each panel. The white dots are areas that did not record fire during those times. And one of the things that's been really interesting in this data set is seeing how very nearby patches, adjacent patches, often were not recording a fire that an adjacent patch did record. So this suggests a lot of heterogeneity, spatial heterogeneity in the burn patterns, sort of the fire perimeter patterns, or at least the patchiness was within those perimeters. Patches over very short distances were oftentimes not burning. We see that in multiple events over multiple years and in both watersheds. And then the other part of this is the heterogeneity in fire severity. Again, being driven by very local factors, it appears, in a lot of these historical fires. And if we compare some of our findings to the work that's been going on over the last few years in Central and Eastern Oregon, one of the things that stands out is that we documented higher fire intervals, so less frequent fire in the northern blues, where our sample resides, than a lot of the other studies that have focused either in the Eastern Cascades, Yochicos, or the Southern Blues. So we're beginning to get into a portion of this gradient that hasn't been sampled well, and certainly revealing some different dynamics as well. And I'll just wrap it up here by saying, I think some of the most important points, one is that you really, to understand these complex systems, we really need to use multi-proxy data, multiple lines of converging evidence. And we've done that here. And I think it's been really important to the story that we've been able to tell. These areas really had an intermediate fire frequency with a lot of variability. And this is different from the models we've used for both low and high elevation forest types. It's not just an intermediate type. It's a unique set of behaviors, and we really need to make sure that we're paying attention to what those behaviors are. One of the takeaways from this work is, despite the dominance of fire-sensitive species in a lot of these watersheds, we've got this pattern of fine-scale spatial heterogeneity, both in terms of frequency and severity, that we did not expect to find in this ecosystem, and we really need to dig into more. In terms of the aggregate outcomes of the fire regime that we documented, it was a fire regime dominated by moderate to high severity effects, but really pretty mixed over time and over space. And the outcome of this was young to intermediate age stands, mostly even aged, and in some cases, multi-cohort, or at least double cohort. I think we've found some more interesting patterns in these fire-sensitive forests than one might have expected, given the fire frequencies and the traits of these species. So I think there's some really interesting questions we're starting to dig into about what are the resilience mechanisms in these ecosystems, given that sort of dichotomy. And an interesting finding, I think, is that the grant for regeneration in these areas was very closely linked to fire overall. We came into this with some questions about how true this was going to be or not. This seems to be not universal, but certainly a prominent pattern in our data. We did document sort of a later onset of fire exclusion in these areas compared to some of the lower areas, which I think makes sense in terms of human access and the degree of change that was going on at different time periods. And differences in the effects of fire exclusion in these ecosystems than we've seen, especially in the drier ecosystems. We did not see a lot of tree establishment following fire exclusion. So these forests haven't become denser, essentially. What has happened, though, is we've got an increasingly homogeneous increase in stand age, and also increased homogeneity in the sense of the horizontal diversity of patch types and structural conditions, as well as that vertical structural heterogeneity that we might have had historically as a result of different stand ages. And the last thing I'll point out is just that this is part of an ongoing effort that we've been making. We've been sampling in I think 3 other watersheds now, some of them here around Baker and in the eastern Willawas. And I'll wrap it up there. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, Cameron. That was an excellent presentation. And I think it really highlighted some of the complexities of these moist mixed conifer forests. So with that, I want to introduce our next speaker for this research session. Our next presenter is Skye Greenler. Skye is a PhD candidate at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry. Her work focuses on collaboratively developing science that directly informs management to reduce the risk of uncharacteristic fires and promote natural fire and forest processes crucial to restoring forest resilience. So Skye is going to present on fire and dry mixed conifer forests this morning. So welcome, Skye.
Hi, everybody. It looks like I can't share my screen until you stop sharing yours. Thank you. Hopefully this will work for us then. Alrighty. Are you guys seeing the presenter view or the other view?
The other view.
Awesome. It flips back and forth for me sometimes. All right, so thanks all for being here today over Zoom. Hopefully someday we can start to have these sorts of events in person again. I definitely miss kind of getting to see everyone and talk about this over lunch and drinks, but.
Skye, sorry to interrupt, but could you swap the presenter view and the.
Are you good now?
Yep, there we go.
All right, thank you. Okay, so my name is Skye Greenler, and I'm a graduate student at Oregon State University in the College of Forestry. And generally, I study ways that we can combine what we know about fire as an ecological process with operational fire management constraints, so that we can move towards restoring landscape and fire and climate resilience. So the work I'm going to talk about today is part of my research working to identify what fire severities might be the most restorative in dry mixed conifer forests. So kind of moving to the drier side of what Cameron was just talking about. In Oregon and much of the Western United States, we're kind of stuck in this fire paradox. On one hand, we know that fire is this natural, important component of many of our ecosystems, but on the other hand, contemporary forest conditions, as well as climate, are increasingly causing wildfires that burn at really uncharacteristically high severities or extents, and cause events that can feel like a catastrophe or a disaster for human communities, ecological systems, and valued resources. And both of these realities are totally valid and reasonable, and balancing them both on a personal level in the ecosystems that we work in and care about, as well as more broadly in fire and forest management, is really challenging. And at the heart of this paradox is the fact that many of our forests in this neck of the woods developed with fire. In Oregon and lots of other places in the West, we have a lot of dry fuels for much of the year. And we see that when we drive around the state, and we have an incredible number of lightning ignitions. So on the bottom here is a map of lightning ignitions in the state of Oregon for a decade, and it's well over 1,000 ignitions a year. So we just have a lot of fire, and we always will. And Because of this, a lot of the species that live in these landscapes are adapted to fire and have fire adapted traits such as thick bark, serotinous cones, resprouting, or these fun pyrophilic beetles that actually can sense smoke. And the specifics of natural fires in these systems vary substantially, as you just kind of heard about from Cameron. But I'm going to be focusing on the drier forests today, which generally had predominantly very frequent low severity fire, though you certainly would sometimes see mixed severity results. So historically, fires influence these landscapes at very small to very large spatial scales. Kind of on the ground, at the surface, fires would reduce your fuel bed depth, recycle nutrients, as well as kind of prepare the seed bed for germination of new species. Moving up from the very surface on the understory, fires would reduce shrub continuity, reduce ladder fuels, so those fuels that kind of carry fire from the ground up into the forest canopy, as well as change the height to the base crown of the tree, so how far down their lower branches were. And at the stand level, we'd see fires influencing tree density, what trees were in these forests, the species composition, as well as the size range that was kind of typical in these forests. And across the landscape, fire would promote varied conditions potentially and natural fire breaks, and it would influence the connectivity of patches and trees. And kind of following the last 100+ years of fire exclusion and various forest management and climate, we now have kind of increased surface fuels, altered germination conditions on the surface, increased understory fuels, increased fuel connectivity, so it's easier for fire to move through and up trees. At the stand level, we have typically kind of denser stands than we saw historically. We have less fire tolerant species, more fire intolerant species, and in general, a smaller average tree size. And on the landscape, we see many landscapes that have increased connectivity and decreased heterogeneity. So disturbances like fire or beetles and other pathogens move through these stands differently than they did historically. So there's important questions to ask at all of these scales, and I think folks will kind of talk about different scales today, but I'm going to kind of predominantly focus on the stand level, so the group of trees in what I'm doing today. So in the past 20 years, there's been a lot of work on ways to restore these forests, to reduce wildfire risk, and kind of restore ecological processes. However, these forests develop with thousands of years of lightning and indigenous fire, and it's challenging to undo the past 100 years of fire exclusion with just a single treatment, especially under our current climatic conditions. And the pace and scale of fuel reduction and fire restoration treatments is just far too low. And we see this on the graph that's on the right here. So on the left side of this graph is the annual number of acres treated in prescribed fire and mechanical fire in the Sierra Nevada. So we're down in California in this example. And in the middle is historically how many acres kind of burned every year, where you'd see that fuel reduction and kind of maintenance of ecosystem processes. And on the right is that treatment backlog. So it's really monstrous compared to the annual number of acres treated. And this research came out in 2012, so it's a bit old, but my understanding is that our backlog looks pretty similar today. So given this, there's increasing concern that focusing primarily on mechanically treating these areas, so going in with chainsaws or other equipment and cutting out specific trees, isn't going to get us where we need to be across the landscape. It's really nice because it's precise. You can choose exactly what conditions you want to create. And if you've got a good crew, create those conditions. But it's expensive, it's really planning intensive, as lots of folks here know. And sometimes it's socially contentious. It's a great option near cities and in the wild-urban interface. But away from the WUI, folks are increasingly talking about using really large-scale prescribed burns or managing wildfires for resource benefit rather than full suppression, to really start working through that treatment backlog. And this is nice because it's a lot cheaper. Sometimes there's less planning that goes into it, sometimes not, but it's a lot less precise. And the fires don't always produce the results that meet the management objectives that we want them to. And we usually think of this unpredictability manifesting in areas where the fire burned too hot and killed too many trees. And this is what our mind and our eyes kind of zoom to, the areas where, wow, that was high severity fire, almost all the trees are dead. And these are areas that the fire wasn't in these dry forests, really restorative, but more of kind of a resetting force. And this isn't the case in all ecosystems, but in our really dry forests is where I'm focusing. And this is driven by high fuel loads and high tree density that kind of came from decades of fire exclusion, as well as sometimes weather conditions that just produce extreme fire behavior. But on the other hand, we also have times where fire burns too cool and can really act too cool to really be restorative. So these are fires that essentially only consume the surface fuels, but don't do much to change tree structure or composition, maybe a little bit in the kind of regeneration layer, but not of existing established trees. And this can happen in both wildfires and prescribed fires, and is often driven by either natural factors like fuels, topography, or weather, but also manager or the public kind of risk tolerance and objectives. So the research I'm presenting today kind of works to identify the middle ground between these two using a two-step modeling process. So I'm going to go through the first step, and then I'll kind of go through the second step and tie them together. So the first thing that we looked at was how fire severity and tree size influenced tree mortality. And to do this, we used data from about 22,000 trees that burned in fires on about 300 CVS plots across Oregon and Washington. And these plots in kind of structure and what's measured are very similar to FIA plots. So permanent plots where every single tree is measured and then they're revisited. So when these plots were first surveyed in the 90s, they were all unburned. And for each one of these plots, we know for every tree, the specific species, the size at the DBH at this first survey, and whether or not it was alive before the fire. And then between the first and the second survey, when these plots were remeasured, all of these plots burned in a fire. And we now know whether the trees were alive or dead after the fire. So we can essentially assume that they were killed in the fire because it's only a decade, but it's certainly an assumption. We know the fire severity that was measured at that plot. And for this, we're using RDNBR, which is a remotely sensed metric of fire severity, kind of really commonly used for a lot of the mapping products that people look at. But it essentially just measures a change in greenness across the entire fire. And we also know the number of years the plot was measured post-fire. And this is important to account for delayed mortality in our model and in our understanding. So this allowed us to make some statistical equations that calculate the probability of mortality for a specific species, say ponderosa pine, based on the size of the tree, the burn severity that it experienced, and the number of years it was surveyed post-fire. And these equations might seem kind of complex and obtuse, but they're really not all that different from what you do in your head when you reach the checkout at a grocery store. And you think, which one of these lines is going to have the highest probability of being the quickest? And you inform your decision based on the number of people in the lines, how much those people have in the carts, maybe if there's a bagger helping out the checkout person, and you decide which is going to have the highest probability. So we did exactly this, but using math and for tree mortality. So we did this for 24 different species that are common across Oregon and Washington, but I'm just showing the results for kind of 8 species here that are common in the Blue Mountains where we virtually are today. And this is a visual representation of the output from those statistical equations. And essentially, the further the dot for a species is from 0, the more important that variable, in this case, we're looking at severity, is for predicting tree mortality. And these are called regression coefficients or regression estimates. So here we see the influence of the variable fire severity on the probability of tree mortality. And in this graph, 0 is on the left side with that kind of gray dotted line. And we see generally as fire severity increases, so does the probability of mortality. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. But we see there is some kind of separation of trees. And essentially what this means is that for Western larch, at low severity, it's relatively resistant, but at high severity, it's less resistant to fire. It's further from zero. So the second graph I want to look at in this is the effect of size on the probability of mortality. And in this graph, 0 is on the left, or on the right side, pardon me, rather than the left side. And we see that for species we typically consider fire intolerant, like Engelmann spruce, lodgepole pine, western white pine. Their estimates are pretty close to 0. So being big confers a little bit more resistance to them, but not much. But our trees that we consider to be more fire tolerant, like ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, they're further from 0. So being large means they have a higher probability of surviving. We also see that grand and white fir, which I lumped for these analyses, falls kind of right between ponderosa pine and Douglas fir. So our model's saying that large grand fir and white fir actually are somewhat resistant to fire. So using that equation that we looked at, you can essentially plug these regression coefficients into that equation, and then multiply them by real values to get an estimated probability of mortality for a specific tree that's of a specific size in a specific fire severity. So for instance, if we think about a 12-inch ponderosa pine, we use these estimates for severity and size, and the years post-fires in there, I'm just using 3 as a background. And what we see is that at a fire that's a severity of 200 RDMBR, we have about a 20% probability of mortality for a 12-inch ponderosa pine. And we can repeat this kind of across the whole severity gradient, and then get this probability of mortality curve. And so we see that as severity increases, the probability of mortality increases, and we kind of hit a plateau where our probability of mortality is quite high, around 800. And you might kind of add some confidence intervals on here to display our uncertainty in our estimates. And we might also look at different sizes. So instead of just being interested in 12 inches, I've also plotted the probability of mortality for a 24-inch ponderosa pine and a 4-inch ponderosa pine. However, and this is where the stats get a little bit complex, but I think it's important for being able to interpret these graphs and think about the work that we did. These estimates actually have a range of possible values around them. I mean, you often see these error bars, meaning, well, we think it's in the middle of this error bar, but it could be anywhere in here. And so instead of just using that mean value, that dot, we can actually randomly draw a variable from inside this distribution based on the proportion where we think it is. So more closer to the mean, fewer further from the mean. And plot that instead. And doing this, most of the time, you're going to get points that are pretty close to your mean. But sometimes you might randomly draw from the low end of severity and the low end of size. And then you're going to get a large tree that dies when, if you just use the mean, you might predict that it would survive. And when you do that, you get a graph that looks like this. So I've just done that hundreds of times for this variable and showed kind of the full range of possibilities for the probability of mortality for ponderosa pine. And what this does is it accounts for the variability that we know exists in fire. Anyone who's been out on the ground after a fire sees big trees that they're like, man, I don't know why that died, it shouldn't have, or a small tree that seems to survive against all odds. So this model really captures and displays all of that, given the variability we just have in fire. So when we look at the graph of ponderosa pine, we see that generally at low and moderate severities, its probability of mortality is quite low. However, when we get to higher severities, especially for the smaller trees, the probability of mortality increases. And we do see a fair amount of variability around this mean, particularly for the larger trees that kind of fall in the lower right-hand corner of this graph, which makes some sense because they've had a lot more life to maybe have defects, or so some of them are really strong and healthy, some of them are maybe pretty close to death, and the fire is just the one thing that pushes them over the edge. And we see that in this model. So if we take a look at Douglas fir, it looks quite similar to ponderosa pine in terms of kind of where all of those values fall. Grand and white fir have a slightly higher base probability of mortality, but follow a pretty similar pattern overall. But even at low severities, they're a little more likely to die. And lodgepole pine, one of our kind of more classically less fire tolerant species, has a higher probability of mortality kind of right out of the gate, and then a lot more variability, and it gets up to those high numbers pretty quickly. So the first thing we did was make those equations and those graphs for all 24 of our species. And the second part of this project, we're going to use these models to predict what would happen to real stands that exist on the ground today at different burn severities. So this is essentially the exact same thing that we did with our individual species. But instead of asking what's the probability of mortality for a specific size tree across the fire severity gradient, we can ask what's the probability of mortality for every single tree in these stands at any fire severity. So we can predict what the stand might look like at 200 RDMBR or 600 RDMBR. And what we do is we just plug the information about this individual tree into our equation. So if this is a small grand fir, we use our grand fir equation, plug in the information, get our probability of mortality out, and do that for every tree. But we didn't just use any current stands in this analysis. We actually used current stands that had estimates of historical density and composition that were either from very nearby or pretty nearby. And these came from both dendrochronological reconstructions or historical timber inventories, kind of depending where in the state we were. So just in our diagram, we kind of see here that historically these stands were less dense, and then with fire exclusion, they've become much denser today. So we did this for about 125 stands across 4 different national forests in Eastern Oregon. And these are ponderosa pine and dry mixed conifer stands that had essentially no history of recent harvest. So but the drier stands and what Cameron was working in. And then for each of these stands, we calculated the probability of mortality for every single tree. We converted that into a prediction of which trees died in the stand. And then we calculated stand level metrics of basal area, density, and species composition. And we did this across the fire severity gradient. And then we use that same framework that we talked about earlier to repeat multiple times from each stand, drawing from the range of possible effects rather than just that mean. And we compared it to historical conditions. So for the sake of time today, I'm just going to go through our results from the dry mixed conifer stands on the Malheur National Forest. We also did this for the Deschutes and the Ochako and the Fremont-Wenema National Forest. So the average density for these stands today is just under 120 trees per acre. And historically, the reconstructions that we used were sitting just under 40 trees per acre. So when we plot the simulations for every stand across the range of fire severities, we get this fuzzy looking graph. And this graph looks somewhat fuzzy because just like the one we looked at earlier, it's actually combined of lots of points from each one of our simulations. So sometimes trees died, sometimes trees didn't, kind of based on that variability. And you can kind of see the lines in this graph of where different stands started. So some of our stands that we modeled had higher densities to begin with, and some had lower densities, but they all went down as fire began to kill those trees. And some stands weren't all that far from historical densities today, but many of them were much higher. And I've colored it so that the blue points are the areas where the majority of the simulations still had densities that were well above the historical mean. And the red points are areas where the majority of the simulations burned too hot and killed too many trees, and they're now below the historical mean. And the yellow points in the middle are this kind of Goldilocks spot where the fire was able to bring that stand back to historical densities, our computer simulated fire. And this tended to fall between maybe 300 and 450 RDMBR. So when we look at stand basal area here, we see similar patterns to density. Contemporarily, that stand is sitting kind of right above 130 square feet per acre. And historically, we were maybe closer to 50. That historical range was wider. So we see a broader kind of range of points where the majority of our simulations fall within that historical range in the yellow and orange in the middle. So finally, we take a look at the species composition graphs. So what's displayed here on the left is the proportion of the total stand basal area that's taken up by different kind of focal species. And on the right, we see the historical composition, which is again the proportion of the basal area. And what we see is that while white and grand fir do decrease somewhat at high fire severities, there's no fire severity that can bring this stand back to its historical compositions. And that high fire severity, where we really start to see a strong decrease in white and grand fir, is really above the point where we're restoring stand density or stand basal area. So these are stands with very few surviving trees, and probably not what many folks would consider restorative. So using these basal area and density graphs, we can start to hone in on the area that has the highest potential of being restorative to assess where maybe 90% of our simulations fell within our historical range, 75% of our simulations, or 50% of the simulations. And this is useful to assess similarities or differences across national forests or vegetation groups, so we can start to compare these windows, which is what I did here. So these are the windows for all of the groups of stands that we modeled for stand basal area. And dry mixed conifer stands are on the top, and ponderosa pine stands are on the bottom. And then we have our 4 different national forests, and then the 3 we modeled for ponderosa pine on the bottom. And what we see is across the board, moderate severity fires looked the most promising to restore basal area. And this was really consistent both in ponderosa pine stands and dry mixed conifer and our national forests. So we don't see a lot of geographic variability here or variability between these 2 dry forest types, which is kind of exciting. It means that maybe we can make kind of broader recommendations rather than needing to be really species specific. And the results we saw for density were very similar. It is worth noting that, as we saw earlier, the individual stands did vary. So your starting condition is somewhat important here. And this is just where basal area is restored. As we talked about, composition isn't restored at any of these severities for any of these forests. So to make real use of these estimated restoration windows, we can use them to reclassify commonly used maps of RDMBR for actual wildfire events, such as the parish cabin pictured here. And these maps typically have low, moderate, or high severity categories that are just related to that remotely sensed change in greenness. But by reclassifying them, the new classes can actually relate to what's likely to be actually living still on the ground. So obviously there's still variability about what's on the ground, but it gives you a place to start post-fire reconnaissance or post-fire management. And in many ways, the most opportunity for restoration might exist in areas where the fire burned a little bit too cool, because you can go back in and with a small amount of mechanical thinning, kind of start to deal with your compositional issues. So a few take-home points as I wrap things up. Fire is a pretty blunt tool for restoration. And it often will take more than a single fire to undo the last 100 years of fire exclusion and forest management. And one of the reasons that we're not seeing fire work as kind of a catch-all restoration tool in this part of the world is that the grand fir and white fir that established after fire exclusion are now at a size where they're relatively fire tolerant. And so even though we consider grand fir to be fire intolerant, we found that moderate severities and relatively large sizes, its probability of mortality is not all that different from species you might not want to kill in the fire, such as Douglas fir and ponderosa pine. So if you look in these boxes on the slide, at moderate severity, grand fir maybe has a 40 to 60% chance of dying in the fire. Ponderosa pine, Douglas fir are lower, especially at lower severities, but not all that much. But fire is an important part of the restoration toolbox. Large prescribed fires and managed wildfires are much cheaper than mechanical treatments. They can be used to treat large areas. They do a better job at restoring heterogeneity in the landscape and are associated with important natural processes that you can't mimic with mechanical treatments. And And while we don't have complete control over the severity of a prescribed burn, these severity targets can help inform our prescriptions and assessment of objectives. And when we have a wildfire event, using these maps, we can capitalize on areas where wildfire was beneficial and put our post-fire resources to use. So really, with both intentional prescribed fires or managed wildfires and unintentional fire, we really need to consider that in most places, fire is essentially just a first treatment. And to really restore structure and that compositional component, we're going to need to follow it up with mechanical thinning in areas that burned too cool, planting in areas that burned too hot, or committing to kind of repeated prescribed burning to start to reintroduce those natural processes and slowly shift the composition. So I guess I have these people to say thanks, and I think we're going to be doing questions after all these presentations. So we'll hold on.
We'll save questions again for the Q&A session here after our next presentation. And as a reminder to please put any questions into the chat box. So thank you, Sky. If you want to stop sharing your screen. Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Tavis Forrester. Tavis is a research biologist with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, where he leads research on carnivore interactions, the effect of habitat treatments on large mammals, and ungulate ecology. His research informs the management and conservation of large mammals and landscapes they need to thrive. Tavis is going to be talking about some of his research this morning, so welcome, Tavis, and you can go ahead and get started with your presentation.
All right.
Tavis, you had the right version before, so if you'll switch back to your other view.
Yep. Sorry, I just had to get off. I had to get unmuted.
There you go. Thank you. We're good right now. Thanks.
All right, great. So thanks everyone for coming. I am a wildlife biologist. I'm going to be talking a lot about carnivores and ungulates because that's what I study. And I'm going to be touching on the effects of climate change we're already seeing on wildlife and how forest restoration can mitigate some of those changes. So we're going to the furry things here. So first, just a quick review of how habitat really affects ungulate populations. The habitat's really critical for the nutritional resources for ungulates. Those nutritional resources build up fat reserves in breeding females. As far as ungulates go, males are not that important in driving the population dynamics. It's really the breeding females that are critical. And so these fat reserves in these female deer and elk have pretty large demographic consequences. They can change the pregnancy rates. They can affect the range of birth dates. And that really affects how the young survive and grow, and the survival of adults, and that drives the population growth rates. What's interesting is that most female survival in ungulates is very high and constant. Once you make it past 2 years old, you're pretty good. But this variation in fawn survival or calf survival for elk really drives changes in population growth. And so that's very sensitive to nutrition. So for predators, it's somewhat similar. This cougar doesn't look so scary yet, but it's a little bit different. Some of the differences are highlighted in red here, where the habitat really affects their prey population levels, and that affects both the body condition of females, how often those females may breed in cougars, while other carnivores have fixed breeding seasons and their litter size may vary. And then also, the more prey there is, the lower the territorial conflict. And so a lot of predators are killed by other predators as they're fighting over territory, which is for resources. So before we get to the forest, I'm going to present the results from several research projects looking at effects of forest restoration, but I want to highlight some of the evidence that we're seeing for climate change and the effects that's already having on ungulates. So these are both temperature and snowpack at Starkey Experimental Forest, which is in the Blue Mountains near La Grande, Oregon. And you can see we're seeing this increase in mean annual temperatures over the last 30 years and this wild variation in spring snowpack from basically nothing to pretty robust snowpack levels. And what we've seen is that we are measuring the body fat on elk inside the experimental forest every year. And what we've seen is that you can see on this left graph that as the mean annual temperature goes up, the body fat of elk entering winter goes down. And that graph doesn't look very steep, but it's almost a 50% decline from 6 to 8 degrees Celsius. So because we're up at like 60% on the very left side, and then, we're down more like 30% when you get all the way up above 8 degrees C. So that's a pretty big decline. We also see that the snowpack depth in March, the higher the snowpack in March, it releases this moisture that really boosts the forage. And so we see higher body fat in winter. So these years where we have no snowpack, where it's wildly fluctuating because of the increased variability due to climate change, if we have really low snowpack, we're down 25, 30% body fat. And if we're at the really high end of that snowpack, we're closer to 60. So again, a 50% swing. The other thing, so we've been monitoring forbs, like small flowering plants in Starkey Experimental Forest. We've been monitoring these things in the 90s, and we also just recently completed another 4 years of monitoring, 2015 to 2019, to look at how long the forb growing season is and when these things senesce. Forbs are key forage plants for mule deer, and they're also really important, although not quite as important for elk. But mule deer, they're critical. And these graphs are pulled out of a publication, but the key thing is that the blue on the left is the 90s, and the red on the right is the 2000s. And we see that in these open pine ecosystems, which is the one in the middle of each graph, the growing days since the 90s have got almost a month shorter. The growing season for these forbs is almost a month shorter. And if you look at the right graph, that's mainly due to the fact that these forbs are drying out and senescing 17 days earlier, a little over 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks earlier than they were in the 90s. So it's driven a lot by temperature and moisture, but we're seeing a much more compressed growing season where these animals can boost up their body fat in the summer. This is also occurring when all the females are lactating and in the spring and when they need food the most. So this is a graph from a recent study a couple years ago in Starkey Experimental Forest again. It's a bit of a complicated graph, but really what you need to see is that this is about digestible energy. And there's this blue line on the bottom, and that's how much digestible energy a mule deer female needs to survive the summer. And so we can see that there's all these different habitat types in this experimental forest. There's pine, grassland, fir, these different forest types, and all of them a deer can survive. But the yellow line is the energy a lactating female needs to support herself during full lactation. And you can see that no habitat types in Starkey Experimental Forest quite reach the energy the 2 years this study was conducted to support a lactating female, which means that the survival of those fawns is really in doubt, and that we would expect that would have pretty big effects on the population, which we have been seeing with our declining mule deer. So how can we mitigate some of these changes? Starkey Experimental Forest and Range is run by the U.S. Forest Service. It's up in the Blue Mountains in Northeast Oregon near La Grande. And we did a couple different research projects to look at the effect of forest restoration on ungulates. So we over the last 20 years, we put GPS collars on a lot of mule deer and a lot of elk, over 900 mule deer and over 700 elk. And then the early 2000s, we conducted a forest treatment where you see this is a map. This is kind of an outline of the Starkey experimental forest that's all fenced, so elk can't move in and out. And although it's technically possible for deer to move in and out, they don't, although carnivores can get underneath and over the fence. And so there were a series of forest stands that were burned and mechanically thinned after burning, similar to what the previous speaker was talking about. And then there was a series of control stands that were not treated. This area is about 77 square kilometers, or roughly 30 square miles. And this is what the treatment looked like. They were mechanically thinned first and then burned. And so the idea is that this would open up the stands, create a lot more sunlight penetration to the floor, which would encourage forage, like a lot of these forbs and lower shrubs, so that the nutritional quantity and quality for these ungulates would go from low in these dense stands to higher, optimistically high. And also that this risk of stand replacing fire theoretically would go down as the ladder fuels and a lot of these smaller, less fire resistant trees like grand fir were thinned out of there. And so we looked at whether deer and elk were using these stands. And so I'm going to show you a few of these graphs. So I'm just going to explain what we're looking at. So on the left side is the relative probability of use. So there's a line at 1, and any thing that overlaps that line means that those elk or deer are using that stand in proportion to its availability. So we looked at all the GPS points, and we summed the points in the treated stands and the control stands versus how a proportion of those area those stands were on the landscape. And so that gives us a probability of use, pretty simple analysis. And so underneath that line at 1 is avoidance, and above that line at 1 is selection. And then this is looking at selection over a 24-hour day. So sunrise and sunset are indicated by these vertical dashed lines, with the nighttime in the darker gray and the daytime in the lighter gray. And the hours of the day are down below. So we averaged these selection ratios over the course of a month, because we were looking to see if there's these seasonal and daily variations in selection. And so the treatment stands are in red. You can see this like kind of selection graph in red, and the control stands are in blue. So we're going to look at some of the stuff we found. And what we found with mule deer is that before these stands were treated, say 2000, they're just kind of muddling around in these stands. Sometimes they're using them in proportion to availability. Sometimes they're avoiding them. There's just no real strong selection pattern. So, and then 0 to 2 years after these are burned and thinned, we see some selection of mule deer. These stands, they're starting to come in at night, a couple hours before sunrise, but it's mostly also during the day. It's kind of muddling around, either use as proportional, use as available, or a slight avoidance. But then 4 to 6 years after these stands are burned, assuming that the shrubs and the forbs have recovered from the fire severity, we start to see a bit of a strong selection pattern. And so mule deer are strongly selecting, about twice as likely to select these stands as available as they are in the early morning before sunrise and right after sunset, which is the prime feeding time for deer. They move to avoid them. This is this farthest right graph. They move to avoid them or just use them as available during the day, probably due to thermal stress. And then these control stands are showing a little spike in selection for them during the day, which makes sense as they're thicker stands. What's interesting is that elk show a much quicker selection of these these forest stands. These are all graphs for selection in July. These now this has changed a little bit. Both these lines are for selection of treated stands. The purple is elk and the red still is deer, but these are both the treated stands. We're not worried about control here. And so we see the year of burn or 1 year after the burn, deer are avoiding these treated stands in the red on the left-hand graph, but elk are already showing a selection for these stands in the prime feeding times and then using them as available during the day. 1 to 3 years after the burn, the elk are very strongly selecting these treated stands at a variety of times a day. They're in there foraging at night. They're starting to forage all afternoon in there. Whereas the deer are still either avoiding or mostly avoiding these stands. And we don't see both the species really starting to select these treatments until 4 to 6 years afterwards. The strength of elk and deer selection is about the same. Elk are using them slightly less, possibly because the shrubs that they were really hitting those first couple of years with the tender new growth are getting a bit more woody. And then the elk are showing an avoidance on this very right-hand graph. They're avoiding these treatment stands during the day. Elk have a lot more thermal stress issues because they're so much bigger. And the deer are still selecting these treated stands during the day, but not quite as much as at night. And the other thing we found is that elk use these restored stands for years. And so this graph shows the probability of use and the time since burn. And this is broken up by nighttime selection and daytime selection. So the blue is night and the red is day. And you can see that elk start selecting these stands almost immediately. Selection peaks about 5 years after burning and thinning, but that they are selecting the stands more than we would expect based on availability all the way out to like 13, 14 years after treatment. We're looking to see if deer also show this selection over time right now. The elk research has already been completed. So a lot of benefits for wildlife off these restored stands. What we don't know is the effect of predators on habitat treatment. We've got cougars that are deer and elk specialists. And so the only effect on them likely is going to be an increase if these nutritional benefits are high. We should see an increase in deer and elk populations, which might bring in more cougars and suppress some of that benefit. Coyotes use more open areas, and so they may come in and reduce some of that fawn survival. But we've also found in other research projects that coyotes, when they have a lot of availability of rodent prey, actually prey on less fawns. So the more rodents that are using these open stands, the less fawn predation. So that's a pretty complicated picture, and we're still analyzing some. We don't have that data analyzed up yet. So in terms of managing risk for wildlife from climate change, we've seen that elk and deer are really heavily using these treated forest stands. They're providing a lot of nutritional benefits, which should really boost these fat reserves in the deer and elk and raise the population growth rate. But at ODFW where I work, we don't really own any land. We don't do any veg management. So that we work with our partners at the Forest Service and other forestry agencies, and we are focused on estimating these population growth rates and population size and feeding that back and forth so that fuels reduction management can also be informed to boost wildlife. I think I'm running into my time here, but I just wanted to mention that I focus on the big furry animals, but there's also several other climate change effects that may or may not be able to be mitigated by forest stand treatment. One is on birds. This is a projected graph of species loss by 2080 due to climate change. This is all temperature driven, so it's unlikely to be mitigated by forest change. There is some good news that there may be, this is the estimated species gain. You'll see species shifting north and a lot more northern species coming south in the non-breeding season. And also the effects on pollinators. So all these flowering plants that drive the forage for deer and elk, 75% of them need pollinators to reproduce. Bumblebees are a major native pollinator here in the Blue Mountains, and 26% of them in North America are threatened. And we're seeing some flowers blooming at weird times because of this climate change, and that is messing with them. But extreme wildfires are also, just like these stand replacing fires, are also wrecking this habitat. And so forest restoration can also support these pollinator communities that are essential for providing these forage for these larger wildlife species. So I'd like to just say thanks to, this was a bunch of these research projects were done by a lot of people that I work with. So I worked with Derek and Tall on the elk, a lot of the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station on some of the elk data, pollinator stuff from Laura Navarrete, and some researchers at University of Idaho and ODFW were funded a lot by Pittman Robertson. So, and I guess can't resist one more cougar kitten picture. Questions are coming next at the Q&A session, I believe.
That sounds good. Thank you, Tavis. If you could stop sharing your screen, we'll now move into the Q&A session. If I could have Sky and Cameron turn on your video. We'll now do the Q&A. Please enter your questions into the chat and indicate who they are for, and then I will read them out to each of the speakers. So the first question we have here in the chat, I think this one is for you, Sky. Did the fire tolerance of grand fir / white fir consider relative effects of insects and disease on grand fir? In Northeast Oregon, we're seeing a lot of insect effects on grand fir. Will this change the predictive fire resilience of these trees?
So we didn't explicitly consider the effect of insects. I mean, that was kind of in the data that we had. Some of that more post-fire mortality probably was compounded by insects in the data that we built the models with, but we didn't include it in that because we purposefully kept those models like really simple so that they could be applied pretty easily to different systems or different targets. But I would certainly expect that once a grand fir has kind of been weakened by insects or disease like you're seeing, that you're going to have a decreased fire tolerance. So that's a great question and one that would be fun to explore, but we didn't look at explicitly.
All right, are there any other questions for our first three speakers this morning for our research session? Please type them in this chat. Here's one that just popped up. Sky, how can commercial harvest be used as one of the tools to get to historic conditions?
That's a great question. And kind of a tricky one. We didn't model that. However, I did with James Johnson, actually in the Blue Mountains with the Blue Mountain Forest Partners, use a very similar modeling framework to essentially model removal probabilities that you might put into a prescription. So say remove 75% of the grand fir between 10 and 15 inches and model what stands look like under different versions of the 21-inch rule or not the 21-inch rule to kind of look at how that affected it. So how can commercial harvest be used as one of the tools to get to historic conditions? I mean, that's a pretty simple, if you're talking commercial harvest, that's kind of more of a thinning. You have a lot of control over what species you remove and what patterns you kind of create in that landscape. And that might look more or less like historical conditions or more or less like predicted future conditions that are supposed to be really resilient. And then once you have those, we can actually run that model on your thinned stands to ask how might fire interact with this at different severities. So if you leave these sort of species and you get a low severity fire, what kind of mortality might you expect?
Okay, and that Johnson paper that you worked on, that was an excellent paper too. So are there similar studies for Western Cascade systems and implications for forest restoration? Is
that another one for me?
Yeah, that was another one for you, sorry.
No, we've talked about essentially doing this exact same modeling on Western systems. The data that we had to build the model predominantly came out of Eastern fires, so we weren't super comfortable applying that to Western systems because the further you get away from your data, the less realistic you get. But we're hoping that with some, in the last decade, not the last year, there's been a lot more fires that had permanent plots on them in Western systems, and then once we get that data, we can kind of add that to the model, make those estimates even more robust, and then hopefully do similar estimates on Western systems. And there's also a couple of really cool historical reconstruction studies that are being done in Western systems. So we'll have some good historical baselines if that's what we want to use, or we could collaboratively develop other baselines to test.
I have a question here for Tavis. What were the treatments in the ungulate study? You may have stated this, but I may have missed it.
Yeah, so great question. So our treatments were basically mechanical thinning followed by a low intensity burn. And so we treated several different patches over 3 years because they couldn't get to them all in 1 year. And then we compared. So those treated stands are the thinned and burned, opened up stands. I saw another question in there about burning and then thinning, but that Sky had definitely talked about that, but the stands in Starkey Experimental Forest were done the traditional way where we thinned first and then removed a lot of the material and burned afterwards.
Yeah, but I can very briefly talk about that. And I mean, one of the things is it's expensive to go in and remove trees with chainsaws, even if especially if they're not commercial value and you just have to pile them and burn them. So especially after some wildfires, there might be areas where that wildfire did a lot of that work for you and killed a lot of the trees that you might otherwise have to remove manually. But if you're kind of below your restoration targets, you can go in and do some kind of selective mechanical thinning to help reach those compositional targets. So it's definitely kind of a flip of what we typically do. But if you're willing to kind of accept a little bit of the variability that comes with fire and or just use what wildfire gives you, it's another opportunity to work towards restoration.
I have another question here for Tavis. Could you please expand on the effect on birds?
Yeah, so in terms of climate change on birds, there's two things happening for birds. One is that because of temperature minimums coming up, there's been a lot of northern range expansion for birds. So the southern edge of bird ranges are moving north and the northern edges are moving north. And so there's a lot of shifting of these ranges, and that runs into habitat development and some things that is causing some species decline. And the second main thing that's happening is that bird migration is photoperiod driven. So it is triggered by a certain daylight length, but insect emergence is temperature driven. And so bird migration, they're kind of arriving at the same time. They always have, but insects are emerging much earlier as the minimums are lower and the temperature goes up. So you're getting these mismatches between migration arrival and birds, and so you're having a lot of starvation during migration, and that's really hitting some populations. We're seeing some pretty weird adaptations to that with like shifting migrations and like short stopping. If those of you who have lived in the Willamette Valley for a long time may realize that there is like a ton more geese in the Willamette Valley than there ever have been because they basically short stopped in all those grass fields instead of going down to the Sacramento Valley. And we see that some of that with songbirds as well.
I have another question for you, Tavis. If you could provide silviculturists in Northeast Oregon some key suggestions for restoring mule deer habitat, what would be at the top of that list, maybe both at large and small scales?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things I didn't talk about in this presentation is that mule deer have really high site fidelity. And so once they establish kind of a range after they're two, these females, they do not stray from that very much at all. And so that's in the small scale for restoring. Thinning out really dense forest is a really good way, you know, if we're not talking about food plots, thinning out really dense forest is a great way to open that understory and bring in forbs and shrubs that the mule deer need. And so that's at the large scale. At the small scale, you need to make those treatments smaller and scattered, because if you put in a really big treatment, only the deer that have ranges that hit that treatment will benefit. And so if you can scatter smaller plots around, it does a lot more benefits for more deer. There's a balance there, because it's not very cost effective to go in and do these tiny little thinnings, but if you can kind of hit in the middle where there's kind of medium-sized treatments that are scattered more than these big blocks, that would be good as well. I mean, deer also love clear cuts, but mainly in the west side. Some of the clear cuts in these dry forests, it gets too hot in the understory, and you basically don't get enough shrub and especially forb recruitment for a while, especially in these like wetter forage seasons. So the thinning is actually, we think, is actually better on this side, on the dry side of the state.
All right, I have a question here for Cameron. How extensive was the characterization your team conducted of stand type across the landscape? Is that characterization available for the Blue Mountains broadly, or just the subregions where you did plots?
We used a couple different types of data sets, and the scales of those was quite different. So for instance, for some of the photo interpretation work of patch characteristics, we have a much broader scale set of data. I think we've got probably between, I don't know, 15 to 20 sub watersheds that have been completely mapped out and photo interpreted and are distributed spatially and across biophysical gradients within the sort of southern northern blues and Wallowas and so on. For the dendroecological data, we have data now from 4 different sub watersheds. Those are not data that we can easily sort of extrapolate. It's pretty intensive data collection, and we have that in the 2 watersheds that I talked about today, the Jubilee Lake area, Beaver Creek, and then also some from the Inaha and the Tucannon areas, and also the Baker, near Baker City, we have another watershed as well. So the dendroecological data is much finer scale data, essentially, but the PI work is much broader scale.
I've been up to some of those plots. It's really interesting. So thank you for being here to present on that. So we are out of time for questions. So I want to thank our research session speakers this morning. Thank you for being here and for presenting at our annual meeting.